I mean, seriously. Ever get headline whiplash? You're just scrolling, right? And it's this constant, relentless flood of shocking, often totally contradictory information. It's confusing. One story zips by and boom, it's immediately replaced by something completely different.
Like 1 second, you're reading about some shadowy political enforcer, the guy supposedly pulling all the strings behind the scenes in the White House.
Then you flick your thumb, and the very next headline is about this massive cultural shift happening in America, something they're calling the Great Dechurching.
And before you've even had a second to process that, you get slammed with another headline about Gen Z protesting a future they see as totally broken, as dystopian.
It is a lot. So you know what? Instead of just letting the whiplash win, let's actually stop for a minute. Let's break this down into a few key themes and see what's really going on beneath the surface of all these stories.
Okay, so first up, America is changing, and it's changing fast. And we're not just talking about politics here. We're talking about these really deep cultural currents that are completely reshaping the country, and a lot of it is driven by a serious breakdown of trust in major institutions.
A huge piece of this is this phenomenon called the Great Dechurching. And this is a big deal. We're talking about tens of millions of Americans, people who used to be regular churchgoers, and now they're just not. It's honestly one of the fastest and biggest religious shifts in the nation's history.
So what's really interesting here is the why. It's kind of like a blame game with two totally different sides. On one hand, you have practicing believers who often point the finger at a broader cultural shift, a decline in traditional values or the rise of secular culture. But then, if you listen to the people who have actually left, they're pointing right back at the church itself. They talk about intense politicization, hypocrisy, or social views that just feel way too rigid.
At the exact same time this is happening, we're seeing this widespread activism from a younger generation that feels like it's inheriting a world that's on the brink. When you hear Gen Z talk about a dystopian future, this is what they mean. They're pointing to the constant threat of climate change, endless wars, crushing student debt, and this feeling of being under constant digital surveillance. It's a really deep skepticism about whether the institutions in charge can solve any of it.
All this anxiety and mistrust is the perfect lead-in to our next theme, the power struggles playing out in Washington. Because when people lose faith in the system, who holds the power and how they use it becomes more critical than ever.
So you've probably seen headlines mentioning a guy named James Blair, described as a White House enforcer for the Trump administration. Now, that's not an official job title you'll find in any textbook, but it's a role with a ton of behind-the-scenes power.
So, what does an enforcer actually do? Well, reporting suggests their main job is to keep the party and lawmakers in line to ensure absolute loyalty. And that raises a really fundamental question about how our policy gets made. Is it about a democratic process, or is it all about personal allegiance to one person's agenda?
And this whole theme of behind-the-scenes power and mistrust, well, it's the very same thing fueling the ongoing Jeffrey Epstein story. As more and more records get unsealed, you see this sentiment pop up everywhere, that the whole process isn't really about justice, it's about protecting powerful people with a sweeping cover-up.
Okay, so this brings us to a really crucial point for anyone trying to stay informed these days. When you see headlines this dramatic, what's the real story behind the hype? Let's take a second and fact-check a couple of these huge international claims.
All right, you've almost certainly seen this one. It sounds absolutely terrifying. North Korea has a nuclear-powered submarine, suggesting this massive escalation in their military power.
So, we have to ask the right question here. Does this headline actually mean that North Korea now has the same kind of advanced, long-range naval power as, say, the United States or Russia? Well, the military analysts, the people who actually study the satellite images and the technical data, they suggest a more nuanced reality. While North Korea is definitely making real steady progress, the sub they showed off is probably a modified diesel-electric sub, not a true nuclear-powered one. So the program is for sure a risk, but the headline definitely overstates how advanced it is right now.
Okay, here's another one that sounds like it was ripped straight from a science fiction movie. You see a headline that Russia is planning to build a nuclear reactor on the moon, and soon.
But if you take a closer look, space policy experts will tell you that while the plans are real, they are also highly aspirational. That timeline of in the next few years? Almost certainly not happening. The actual targets are more like the 2030s, maybe even later. And the whole thing depends on money and technology that Russia is really struggling with right now.
So, what does this all mean for how we read and understand the news every day?
Well, it means the real story, the one with context and nuance, is almost never just in the initial headline.
Let's circle back to that Epstein story for a perfect example. A headline screams, "Million more Epstein docs found," and it makes it sound like this shocking new discovery. The reality, though, is that this is just part of an ongoing release of records. And those heavy redactions, while they absolutely fuel suspicion, they're also a standard required part of the legal process in sensitive cases like this.
And that right there perfectly illustrates the key takeaway from all of this. Whether we're talking about politics, culture, or global security, the real, meaningful story often isn't in that shocking headline. It's in the details, the context, and the data that follow. The headline is designed to get your attention. It's our job to go further.
So, in a world of endless headlines, being truly informed isn't about knowing every single story, it's about choosing which stories you're going to look deeper into and asking that next question. So, what story will you look deeper into today? Thanks for joining this explainer.